Okay, welcome back everybody. We're gonna pick off where we left on the last video. This is chapter 18, part 2. So we've been talking about trade, and we've been talking about net exports and net capital outflow. And we found out that net exports equals net capital outflow. It's an important identity in trade. And now we're gonna talk about exchange rates. And now we're gonna talk about how exchange rates actually affect NCO and net exports, and how does that dynamic work out. So let's look at these things. We're going to talk about the nominal exchange rate, and that's going to be just the exchange rate that you see at the airport. When you go and you see currency exchange, that's going to be the nominal exchange rate. So you see, for example, per $1, we get 132 Canadian dollars. That means that the dollar is worth more than the Canadian dollar. We get, for $1, we get 1.32 dollars or Canadian dollars. But a US dollar is not worth as much as a euro because we give it one full dollar, but we only get 0.91 euros in return. And of course, the Japanese yen is a way different exchange rate, and the Mexican peso as well. So here what we're trying to say is that, well, if I wanted to exchange dollars to euros, these are going to be the nominal exchange rates. And this is going to be the exchange rate that we see at the airport. So appreciation or strengthening of a currency means that the increase in the value of a currency as measured by the amount of foreign currency it can buy. So that means that if the dollar strengthened, or if the dollar appreciated, that means that the dollar can buy more foreign currency. That means that the dollar is strong, it's strengthened, it can buy now more pesos, more yen, more euros. If the dollar weakened, that means that it can buy less of foreign currency. That means that it can buy less pesos, less euros. So let's take an example here. We're going to say Khalid exchanged $1 for 100 Japanese yen. But this year, he exchanged $1 for 105 Japanese yen. So last year, 1 for 100. This year, 1 for 105. So that means that the dollar strengthened or weakened. Well, here we know that the dollar strengthened because it used to be that used to only buy 100 yen per $1. Now I can buy 100. I buy more yen per $1. That means that the dollar has strengthened. The dollar has strengthened or the dollar has appreciated. Those two words are more or less the same: appreciation and strengthened. That means that the opposite happened on the yen side. Okay, so whatever happens on the dollar side means the opposite happened on the yen side. So if a dollar strengthened, the yen weakened. If the dollar appreciated, the yen depreciated. Let's look at another example. Khalid exchanged $1 for 25 pesos. Now he can exchange $1 for only 20 pesos. So that means that the dollar can now buy less foreign currency. So that means the dollar depreciated or weakened. And if the dollar depreciated, that means that the peso appreciated, or the peso became more expensive. Okay, so that was going to be the nominal exchange rate, but let's now look at the real exchange rate. So we always know that whenever we change the words nominal to real, we just say that we're not going to take into account prices, and we want to take into account just quantities. What we're going to do, so the real exchange rate is going to be the rate at which goods and services of one country trade for the goods and services for another, right? So here we're not saying that the rate of which currency trades for another currency. We're saying how much does a American Big Mac trade for a Mexican Big Mac, right? Now we're actually trading goods. The real exchange rate is going to be defined as this. E is going to be our nominal exchange rate. P is our domestic price. So E times P is going to be the price as expressed in foreign currency, right? Because we take our domestic price, we multiply it by the nominal exchange rate, and on the numerator here, we get the price of a good, let's call it a Big Mac, in this foreign currency, in now maybe pesos, right? We divide that by the price of a good in that currency, or we divide it by the good of a Big Mac in pesos, and we get the real exchange rate. And the idea here is that these things should be equal to 1, right? If I'm getting a Big Mac in Mexico versus a Big Mac in the US, this should be the same Big Mac, and the real exchange rate is really equal to 1, okay? But what we actually find is that the real exchange rate does not equal to 1. And the reason being is because of changes in the price or changes in the nominal exchange rate. So let's take a look at that here. So notice that this equation is important. This is saying that the real exchange rate is equal to E times P, right, on the numerator. And this E times P is just saying that now I've expressed a price of a good, right, in some foreign currency. Let's say that it's a Big Mac, and now I know what this Big Mac cost in euros. And we're going to divide it by the price of a Big Mac in euros, right? And these two things should be the same number, but they're frequently not, and we'll see why that happens in a bit. Okay, so we're going to talk about Big Macs. We say a Big Mac costs $4 in the US, 380 yen in Japan, and the exchange rate is 10 yen per dollar. So essentially, we've got P, price in the US, the domestic price. We've got the price in Japan, and we've got E, the exchange rate. So we've essentially got all our pieces of this equation. And we can figure out what the real exchange rate is. Well, the numerator is just going to be E times P. So we take the exchange rate, 110 yen per dollar, multiplied by $4 per Big Mac, and that's going to equal 440 yen per US Big Mac. So like I said, the numerator is just expressing the price of a good in some foreign price. But now let's divide it by the actual price in Japan. And what we find is that, well, it doesn't really cost 440 yen in Japan. It actually just costs 380 yen in Japan. And that means that the real exchange rate is 1.16 Japanese Big Macs per US Big Mac, okay? And this is saying that, well, Japanese Big Macs are a little bit more expensive than US Big Macs, okay? They're paying a little bit more, that means that US Big Macs are a little bit more expensive in the US relative to Japanese. They're a little cheaper in Japan. Okay, let's look at another example. So now we're going to talk about Starbucks latte. Exchange rate is 20 pesos per dollar, per $1. The price in the US is $3. The price in Mexico is 40 pesos. So what is the price of the US latte measured in pesos? That's just the numerator that we were talking about, E times P. And it says in part B, let's calculate the real exchange rate, and we'll do that in a bit. So let's talk about A first. What is the price of a US latte measured in pesos? Well, I just need to take the exchange rate, 20 pesos per dollar, multiply it by the price, $3 per US latte, and we get that the US latte is actually worth 60 pesos, okay? And this is given US prices. But we actually find that, wait a minute, if we charge $3 per latte in the US and it's 20 pesos per dollar, that's 60 pesos. But wait, the price in Mexico is actually 40 pesos. It's a lot cheaper than what I'm paying here in the US. Okay, so you find that here the real exchange rate is going to be the difference in those two prices, or at least the division of those two numbers, 60 pesos divided by 40 pesos, that equals 1.5. And that shows you that, well, that means that the prices here in the US is a little bit more expensive than prices in Mexico, because here we're paying 60 pesos per latte, whereas in Mexico it's only 40 pesos per latte. What gives? What's going on here? Why are these prices not the same? It's the same latte, it's the same Big Mac, but I'm paying 60 over here and 40 over there. What gives? Okay, and we're going to talk about that in just a bit. So, here's just kind of a review. We can also look at this real exchange rate, E times P divided by P star. Of course, this is going to be the domestic price. This is going to be the international price. We looked at it in terms of Big Macs and Starbucks latte, but we can also look at it in terms of CPI, the Consumer Price Index, or the price level, right? US price level P or Consumer Price Index. So they're the same thing. That's just going to be a basket of goods. And that's a better way of calculating the real exchange rate rather than just looking at one good like the Big Mac or like the latte. Let's just take a basket of goods, and that's just a better measure of real prices or relative prices between the US and some other country. So now we can kind of just exchange, instead of just the price of goods or services, let's exchange these P's for Consumer Price Index in general. Okay, so here's something that should happen but doesn't. And what saying is that, well, purchasing power parity. A theory of exchange rates whereby a unit of any given currency should be able to buy the same quantity of goods in all countries. That means that $1 in the US, which may maybe buys you, so let's first say, for example, a can of Coke, right, or a can of Pepsi, should buy you a can of Coke or a can of Pepsi in France or in Argentina or in Indonesia. And that's the idea that, well, based on the law of one price, that the same good should sell for the same price in all locations. Why should this happen? Well, because if it didn't, if there were different prices for the same good, then we can make arbitrage profits. And arbitrage profit says that we can take advantage of price differences in different markets. So let's take an example of arbitrage. Let's see how based on the law of one price and based on arbitrage, we should have purchasing power parity in theory. Of course, in the real world, this doesn't happen, but let's see how this should work in theory. If coffee beans sell for $4 a pound in Seattle and $5 a pound in Boston, so that's West Coast, East Coast, and coffee beans can be costlessly transported, how will the two markets reach equilibrium? So based on the law of one price and based on arbitrage, I can take advantage of the difference in prices over here. Why don't I buy coffee cheap in Seattle, move it over to Boston and sell it for expensive, sell it high? That means for every pound I make $1. If I buy 1,000 pounds in Seattle for $4,000 and sell it in Boston for $5,000 because I've got 1,000 pounds and I sell for $5 a pop, then I make an instant $1,000, right? And that's great. I like money. And that's the purpose of arbitrage. When we talk about arbitrage, it's saying that, hey, I can just buy here, sell here, and make the difference in money. But what happens when I do that and you do that and everybody does that in the economy and everybody realizes that, hey, this is, essentially easy money. Well, if we all are buying money or buying coffee in Seattle, what happens to the price in Seattle? Well, the price goes up because there's increased demand for coffee in Seattle. And likewise, if we're all going to Boston and selling this stuff, an increased supply drives the price down in Boston. And you can see these examples by just doing shifts in the supply and demand curve. If you're a little confused as how this happened, go draw a supply and demand graph and show what happens when we have an increase in demand for coffee in Seattle. That's a shift in the demand curve to the right, and what happens to the price in Seattle. And then draw a different supply and demand curve for Boston and say that, oh, well, if we have an increase in supply in Boston, what happens to the price? You'll see the price goes down by just shifting the supply curve to the right. And why is this happening? Well, because we're buying all of this coffee in Seattle and we're going and we're selling it in Boston. Okay? So as a result, if that happens, that means that this will keep on happening until these two prices are equal, right? If we're buying a coffee in Seattle, this will push up this $4 upwards, and we're selling it in Boston, this will push down this $5, and they'll essentially meet maybe right in the middle at 4.5, and these two prices will be equal. Okay, and this is just to show that in theory, all prices should be equal just by arbitrage. Of course, this doesn't really happen, as we can see with the example of the Starbucks latte and the Big Mac. Prices aren't quite equal, and this doesn't really hold in reality. And we'll see why that happens in just a bit. Okay. So if we were going to use purchasing power parity is really saying that the real interest rate is equal to 1. Why is the real interest rate equal to 1? Well, remember, the real interest rate is equal to E times P divided by the foreign price. And E times P on the numerator is just the price of a good expressed in foreign currency. And by the law of one price, or the purchasing power parity idea, these two things should be equal. My numerator and my denominator should be perfectly equal such that the real interest rate is equal to 1. Now, here we're saying here, using that theory, we can say that the nominal exchange rate is just going to equal, this is going to be the price in foreign goods divided by the domestic price. And if you're kind of confused as where did this equation come from, go look at the real interest rate equation. Real interest rate is equal to E times P divided by P star, the foreign price. And that's going to equal the real interest rate real RER, or real interest rate. But let's not forget that we're saying that under the purchasing power parity, real interest rate is equal to 1. Let's see if I can get the equation here. Yeah, here we are. So if you look at, oh my God, so far. All right, if we look at this equation over here, and we're saying that the real interest rate should, or the real exchange rate should equal 1, because of arbitrage and the fact that the law of one price. If this is equal to 1, we'll just rearrange this equation, bring P over to this side, right? And then divide by P, and then you get an expression for E, where you kind of isolated E on one side by itself, and everything else is on the left-hand side, assuming that the real exchange rate is equal to 1. Now, if you do that, that allows you to do this. That allows you to do this equation right here, saying that, well, I can just divide the relative prices and I can get the nominal exchange rate, which is just our little e. And that happens because this is the resulting equation, right? By when I told you to rearrange that real interest rate equation to isolate E, well, this is what you get. But notice that you only get this if you assume purchasing power parity. If you assume that the real exchange rate is equal to 1. That means that a Big Mac in Japan is equal to a Big Mac in US, or a latte in Mexico is equal to a latte in the US. And those things aren't really quite accurate. So it means that nominal exchange rates change when price levels change, right? If we're going to assume that the real interest rate, or at least is stable, real exchange rate is stable, that means that changes in price levels induce changes in the exchange rate. And of course, what changes price levels? Well, we know that money supply changes price levels. So that means that when a central bank increases the money supply, that causes the price level to rise. And if the price level is rising, it also causes that country's currency to depreciate relative to other countries in the world. Now let's think about that for a second. We're saying that when we increase the money supply, price levels rise, and if price level rise, the exchange rate depreciates. That comes from over here, right? If this P increases, right, the exchange rate decreases, and that's what this is saying right here. But another way to think about it is you can say that, well, if the central bank is increasing the money supply, that means that there's a lot of dollars floating around. And there's even more now because the central bank is increasing the money supply. And if there's a lot of dollars, that means that dollars is not very scarce. That means that there's a lot of it floating around, and it's not very scarce. There's just a lot of it in the economy or in the world economy. And as a result, the exchange rate depreciates. It's a weaker dollar because it's very abundant. There's not a lot of scarcity there, and that's because of the increase in money supply. So you can think about it two ways. You can think about it, those two ways that I just mentioned. Okay, so like I've been saying, hey, purchasing power parity does not always hold in practice. In theory, it's kind of like a nice idea. Yeah, a Big Mac should be equal to a Big Mac in Japan versus the US and so on and so forth, but they're really not. And the reason being is because, well, some stuff is not easily traded, right? Like haircuts, right? Haircuts are not easily traded. You can't trade a haircut from Japan to the US. And the reason being is because it's geography specific, right? You need to be in the same location as your barber and so on and so forth. So some goods aren't easily traded, and that's why PPP doesn't always hold it in practice. But then even when goods are tradable, they're not perfect substitutes. And the idea here is that, well, a Big Mac in the US is better than a Big Mac in Germany because a Big Mac is American, right? Americans know how to make burgers better than the Japanese. You can even look at it the other way around, saying that if you go to Japan, right, sushi will be a lot better than sushi in the US. Just like Big Macs in the US will be better than Big Macs in Japan. And as a result, these two things aren't perfect substitutes, right? A sushi dinner in Tokyo is very different than a sushi dinner in Ohio. And these two things, even though that there's the same kind of good, we're talking about, how many pieces of sushi, they're not perfect substitutes because there's quality difference, right? And that's going to be another reason why purchasing power parity doesn't So it's not a perfect theory. It's kind of like a start. We also do see that real exchange rates do fluctuate over time, and any changes in the nominal exchange rate typically reflect changes in price levels, right? So if we see exchange rates are changing, it's really a reflection of changing price levels at home or abroad. And of course, what is a price level a function of? Well, we know that price levels are a function of money supply, right? Central banks increase or decrease the money supply. That increases or decreases our price levels, which increase or decreases our nominal exchange rates. So here is an example of Germany in 1921 to 24. And you can see that when the money supply, look at the green line, increased a lot, the price level immediately tracked it. And that's the reason being is because we increase the money supply. If we increase the money supply, that means that there's a lot of German currency floating around. If there's a lot of German currency floating around, that means that prices is going up. Prices are going up because of that currency is no longer valuable. It's less and less valuable as we print more of it. And if price levels are going up, well, look at what exchange rates happen. They kind of mimic it exactly. When price levels go up, exchange rates go down. Okay, or you can also think about it, well, we don't even need to think about price level. We can just think about it from money supply only. When the money supply goes up, exchange rates go down because, well, there's a lot of this German currency now. It's not valuable. The exchange rate goes down because everybody has it. There's a lot of this German currency, and it's not really trading for a lot because it's just there's a lot of abundance. Okay, so that's going to be this chapter that we just talked about. Really, to kind of review, we've talked about net exports and how net exports is equal to net capital outflow, and that dynamic is really, really important. But then we also talked about nominal exchange rates, and we talked about real exchange rates and how those two things interact with one another. And we talked about the theory of purchasing power parity, how it's a nice theory in theory, but not in practice because it doesn't really hold in practice. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 18. Next week we'll be talking about chapter 19, the next chapter. Thank you.